There's been a lot of pushback by mainstream media against hydroxychloroquine, with journalists often attempting to override the views and research from physicians. Why do you think the media often posts only negative information about hydroxychloroquine?
Oh my gosh, the doctors, we've been thinking about this since the beginning. Before it became politicized, most of us were pretty excited about hydroxychloroquine because it's a really safe medicine, a really safe drug, and it's just completely not controversial. We give it to elderly patients, we give it to children, we give it to breastfeeding women, we give it to pregnant women, we give it to immune-compromised patients. So I thought, wow, this is just, this is great, this is the solution. And then President Trump mentioned that he thought it was a good possibility. And the next day, the media just went crazy as though it was a terrible option. And ever since then, they haven't let up, and they just keep saying how bad it is. Now, you ask me why they're doing that. I think the majority of journalists really are just drinking the same Kool-Aid that they've drunk for a long time. And I think a few probably know differently, but there's multiple levels of misinformation. I think it rises almost to the level of corruption. But I put them into 4 different categories. There's the scientific journals, there's the media, there's the state governments, and then there's the federal government. So the scientific journals have actually printed corrupt data, fraudulent data. That was the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. They used fraudulent data. The company they got that fraudulent data from wouldn't reveal their data, so they had to retract the studies, but that company called Surgisphere has actually been scrubbed from the internet. I mean, this is just incredibly dramatic. The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, those are the world famous publications. JAMA also had a very, it wasn't retracted their study, but that was a study that said hydroxychloroquine didn't work, but it was actually chloroquine in that study, but they gave super toxic dosages. They gave almost three times the dose they should give. So you've got like kind of corrupt scientific journals. Then the next level of the corruption, or at least obfuscation, is the media. So the media, if they're innocent, they're reporting these journal studies, but if they were truly innocent, right, they would then report in just as big numbers the studies have been retracted, right? Or they would also report the positive studies. You've heard today, there's dozens and dozens of positive studies about hydroxychloroquine.
There has been an unprecedented infringement on the doctor-patient relationship from governors, often restricting pharmacies from prescribing hydroxychloroquine. How do you feel about governors restricting its use? And what do you think about the politicization of healthcare?
Oh my goodness. So again, as a board certified emergency physician, the whole reason I got involved in this is because I was restricted from prescribing an FDA-approved medication for patients who needed it. This has never happened before in medicine. There's never been a situation that a drug is cheap, generic, safe, FDA-approved for 65 years. This particular drug happens to have been used billions of times worldwide. It derives from quinine, which is in tree bark. It's been given, to centuries, really. I mean, General Washington gave it to his troops in the Revolutionary War. So to then have the governors, through the state boards, threaten us, we were threatened with unprofessional conduct if we prescribed hydroxychloroquine. This has never happened. This, for me, was the reason I started talking about this publicly, because the doctor-patient relationship has to be sacrosanct. That's just the one corner of the universe where the patient's actually honest, the doctor gives their best assessment or information, and it was completely violated because patients were hearing from the media that this drug didn't work, so they weren't interested. I couldn't sit and combat that because I was being told if I prescribe it, I could be told that I was guilty of unprofessional conduct. So all of a sudden, I didn't have free speech with my patients. They didn't have free speech with me. This is just terrible. This really, separate from COVID, separate from hydroxychloroquine, this is super dangerous. The governors empowered the state pharmacies through the pharmacy boards to question if doctors were prescribing it. It is routine. You can look all over the internet. You can find audio tapes really, of doctors on the phone with pharmacists. Pharmacists are refusing to fill their prescriptions. This has just never happened.
Even with mask mandates, extremely low mortality rates, and treatment options like hydroxychloroquine available, there is a large debate about reopening schools in the fall. Do you think schools should be reopened?
Yeah, it's fictitious. There is no scientific debate if schools should be open, none at all. So we are setting up a fake narrative when they say, is school safe, right? There is no such thing as a risk-free life. It just doesn't exist. So you have to think of everything in terms of lower risk and higher risk. So is it lower risk to stay home or lower risk to go to school? It's orders of magnitude lower risk to go to school. When kids have been staying home, as they've done for the last several months, the incidence of anxiety and the incidence of interpersonal conflict and the incidence of child abuse that's been missed, or the kids that didn't get hot lunches, not even to mention all the educational problems, things that they didn't have, that's very high risk. We know that's high risk. So then you look at the other side, what is the risk of the disease? Well, the risk of the disease amongst children is exceedingly low. We heard all about that today. Kids typically don't get the virus, but when they do, they almost never get sick. And those that do get really, really sick, the numbers are incredibly low. They're much, much, much lower than influenza, for example. And nobody would think to have this conversation with influenza. So there's actually no debate from a scientific perspective. The only debate that's existing is in the media or unions, or politicians. There's no scientific debate. Of course, children should be in school.
Oftentimes in the media, they mention that QT prolongation is a reason not to prescribe hydroxychloroquine, and that it's dangerous for that reason. Can you elaborate a little bit more about QT prolongation, what it is, and if it's worrisome as the media says?
Right. So the media really grabbed onto this QT prolongation. So QT prolongation is it's a feature of the EKG between the Q and the T. It's always supposed to be a certain length, right? And depending on how fast your heart is beating. So there are many, many drugs, hundreds, that prolong that interval. It's called the QT interval. It makes it a little too long. If it makes it very, very, very long, then it can interfere with the next heartbeat, and that could cause an arrhythmia or even a fatal arrhythmia, a heartbeat that's irregular to the point of being fatal. Now, how likely is this to happen? Well, first of all, hundreds of drugs cause QT prolongation. A very common one we use all the time is a drug called Zofran. We give it for nausea. We give it all the time, and we don't check EKGs beforehand. It's just well known, and that's just what you do. The hydroxychloroquine, until COVID, was predominantly prescribed by rheumatologists, and when they started this drug in their practices, they never even did an EKG, a baseline EKG. It just wasn't considered a really big problem. So the QT can get prolonged. It's a fact, but it's uncommon. When it does happen, it usually happens in patients who have heart disease. Now, so it was absolutely overblown, fear-mongering times 100. So it was factually true that in older, or specifically patients that had underlying heart disease, you could get a prolongation of the QT, but that didn't mean it was going to run into a fatal problem. It could just get a little bit long and not be a fatal problem. This specific question has actually been asked and answered. The American Heart Association, April 29, 2020, published on this very subject. It says, in the era of COVID, they studied hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, again, that antibiotic. They both can prolong the QT interval, because I said many drugs prolong the QT interval. Azithromycin is another one. The question was, especially if you use them together, could it prolong it just enough to really be a problem? So it studied it by itself and studied it in conjunction together. And it turns out that no, it did not. It did not cause any fatal arrhythmias, and it didn't even cause a problem enough that you had to stop the drug.
There are dozens of countries that have hydroxychloroquine available over the counter. Do you think this is feasible in the United States, and what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So it's not only feasible, it's actually the only solution, because of the 4 levels of obfuscation and disinformation I mentioned, the scientific journals, the media, the state, and the federal. If we don't make it over the counter, then patients are going to need to go through doctors and pharmacists to get access to this drug. And at that point, that's going to be months and months in the making. So the only solution for the American people really is to be over the counter. Now, drugs do go from prescription to over the counter. That happens all the time. It happens usually when there's a consumer demand and there's a reason to put it over the counter. So Zantac or meclizine or nicotine patches or minoxidil for the hair. There's a consumer demand for that, and so the drug manufacturer looks to make it over the counter. There's been no consumer demand ever to make hydroxychloroquine over the counter in America, because we didn't have such a need for it, right? In malaria endemic areas, they do. So that's really why it hasn't moved over the counter. There's also no current USA manufacturer of hydroxychloroquine, so no one's really pushing for it. But it needs to happen, and there are ways to do it. You can get a citizen petition to do it. That's how Plan B came to the marketplace. There's ways to do it safely. You could restrict the total quantity, even though it's very safe. Obviously, people can make mistakes and do foolish things and overdose or take too many, but you can certainly restrict the amount. You could even restrict it by keeping it behind the pharmacy shelf where the pharmacist keeps Sudafed. There's many ways you can do this logistically and do it over the counter safely. I don't see any other solution other than being over the counter, because I'm so pessimistic, having lived it, that we can remove the restrictions that the state governors have put in place to block me from giving patients what they need.